Welcome to another episode of the Full Crew Newscast. I am your host, Rex Alexander, Infrastructure Ambassador for Autonomy Global, broadcasting today from EAA AirVenture 2026 in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. This is episode 82 of the Full Crew, and today's theme is tech policy. We'll be discussing the latest AI policies, supersonic noise policy in the U.S., and drone policy as it applies to the recent FIFA World Cup games held here in the United States. Before I introduce our crew, I would like to make sure that we thank our sponsors. Full Crew always sponsored by LiveU, and today sponsored by Airspace Link and Viasat. Now for today's guest that we'll be introducing, and they'll give you a 30-second life history. First up is Erika Carrasco.
Thank you. I'm Erika Carrasco, a partner at MLT Aitkins in our advocacy group based in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. My practice focuses on complex commercial litigation, privacy, cybersecurity, emerging technology, artificial intelligence, and aviation law, with a particular emphasis on drones, autonomous systems, and advanced air mobility. What distinguishes MLT Aitkins from many other firms in Canada is truly our bench strength in emerging sectors like drones, AI, advanced air mobility, small modular nuclear reactors, and data centers, to name a few. We have more than 350 lawyers across Western Canada that bring together leading litigators, technology, privacy, cybersecurity, regulatory, Indigenous, and government relation professionals to allow us to provide a truly multidisciplinary approach on these types of complex matters that are being faced by organizations in the rapidly evolving technology landscape. So tech policy is very important to us.
Thank you, Erika. Now, second up, we have Courtney Freeman. Courtney, take it away.
Hi there, Courtney Freeman. I'm counsel at Adams and Reese. I live in Seattle. I'm associated with the DC office, so both Washingtons. Adams and Reese is a recently Chambers Band 1 ranked aviation and aerospace regulatory practice. We cover both traditional and emerging aviation issues of all kinds. And prior to the great crew at Adams and Reese, I spent 10 years with the FAA and another year before that at the Department of Transportation as an honors attorney. And during my time at the FAA, I was in the operations law branch, team in the Office of the Chief Counsel doing regulatory operations work as a staff attorney, and then a senior attorney, and then the manager of the group. And that is where I worked with one of our Chris.
Thank you so much, Courtney. And last but not least, Chris Senn.
All right. Hello, everyone. Chris Senn here. Let's see, where should I begin? So currently I am a senior associate at Greenberg Traurig. It's a global law firm based in Miami, Florida, but we have over 50 offices all throughout the world. Actually just started here about 2 months ago, but my career started in the Marine Corps. I started out flying drones. I'm known for being an expert in drones, but there are many out there. And then following my time in the Marine Corps, I went on to work at a company called Raytheon, did that instructing drones, and then got my graduate degree and went on to teach as an assistant professor of aviation at Kansas State University. While there, that led me to the law, which is how I became an attorney. And then after that, I've hopped in and out of private practice 3 times. This is my 3rd time in private practice. Arizona initially, then I went to Capitol Hill and became the aviation attorney up there for the House of Representatives. Then back in private practice, and as of the latest government service I held, I was the assistant administrator for government and industry affairs at the FAA for a little over a year and 3 months. I came in a little after the DCA crash last year. Got a call from some officials in the government, and they said they could use someone to help them get back on their feet and respond to Congress as it relates to the crash. So really looking forward to speaking to some of the things that I know as it relates to drones today, and I think we'll have a good conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. And Erika, you're first in the spin cycle. So we'll bring up the article, but why this article, and what do you feel is most important to get across to our audience?
Yeah, the articles I had chosen two, and I think the one that's up on the screen is the BBC article about what to know about Canada's new AI strategy. There's also the Canadian Bar Association National Magazine article called Canada's AI Strategy, Clear Direction or Digital Self-Sabotage. So I just wanted to talk a little bit to the audience about this national AI strategy that Canada's put forward. I thought it was interesting for a few reasons. I looked at it sort of in juxtaposition with the way that tech policy had developed with drones and advanced air mobility, watching that from its inception back in 2014 to today, and now watching how this government is trying to address AI. And so I thought it was important to sort of compare and contrast those two to see, is this going to work? How is this going to work? And what does it really mean for those practicing or trying to commercialize in drones and robotics, whether in Canada or globally? So I thought maybe I'd start with just sort of talking a little bit about what the strategy is to set the tone, and then some of what the criticisms are of the strategy. So right now, the federal government has created this roadmap to really make sure that Canada remains a global leader in AI. We had a plan back in 2017 when that we first launched that really focused on building AI research and talent. This new strategy is called AI for All. The government says that's not just a slogan, but an actual strategy. And it expands that research vision from not just research, but into economic growth, adoption of AI across industries, public trust, and again, keeping technology sovereign to Canada, which I know that in the US is a big topic as well. So, I thought that's interesting that Canada's now sort of really taking a stance on that as well. So at the core, the strategy recognizes that AI is a foundational technology, much like the internet was when it first became prevalent. And so the government's goal now is to ensure that Canada not only develops leading AI technology, but captures economic and social benefits in deploying them. So there's 6 pillars that have been identified. 1, protecting Canadians and safeguarding democracy. 2, empowering Canadians. 3, sharing prosperity. 4, building Canadian sovereignty AI foundations. 5, scaling Canadian champions. And 6, building trusted global partnerships. But more important to those 6 pillars is there's also been some industries identified that includes both manufacturing and robotics and transportation. So in the drone and robotics industries, that's important for us to take note, and how this strategy will dovetail with our own regulations and what it will mean for that. So, moving on to this, obviously the key takeaway is that the strategy is about positioning Canada as a driver in the AI economy. But we see these common themes of building trust, developing capabilities in the robotics and drone industry. There's still that issue and those hurdles and gaps that need to be overcome. And so when you look at that, if you now start comparing, we have regulations, we have laws in place for drones. The robotics industry is evolving together with AI and doesn't have as many regulations in Canada, but we've watched as Canada regulates the drone industry from visual line of sight into beyond visual line of sight, low risk, and where we're going now with some consultation on remote ID and other topics. And you see that while this strategy is not legislation and isn't binding or creating any kind of adverse consequences on those who don't follow it, that it is trying to enable technology to drive as opposed to legislation driving. And then the question becomes, as the CBA article refers to, is this clear direction, or is this some kind of self-sabotage where there is no direction for anyone to move forward? You also see a common theme that we see in the robotics and drone industry, which is a start with the good use policies, right? So how can AI be used in the healthcare system? How can it be used to level the playing field for good? And that's similar to when we hear about drones for good, right? When we're talking about drones for first responders and things of that nature, that really seems to be driving and wanting to be the focus of creating social acceptance and public trust. But the real gap here that I see for all of these industries, whether strategy or legislation, is that it still hasn't addressed what will happen in the interim. So right now we still have a gap in investment. That's a huge issue, whether it's for any of the pillars that the strategy talks about. We still have a gap in talent. So we're still having graduates, post-secondary graduates coming out with technology degrees, software development degrees that can't get jobs because AI has created this uncertainty about whether we need those individuals or not. And so while we have a strategy that proposes to address this in the future, it doesn't really address the gap in the interim. And so there's still a lot of questions about that. And they talk about educating the public confidence and trust. But there's still, again, that large gap between those who really don't know enough about data collection, data centers, AI, deep fakes. So yes, we can start doing that and we have to. But in the interim, how do we address the fact that there's a large population worldwide, I would say, in North America, certainly, that doesn't understand what drones are being used for, what AI is being used for. We're still only hearing from the media about the bad use cases. So again, those are questions that I wonder about with either strategy or regulation. And just to sort of close off of where these articles kind of leave off is, they talk about where Canada had legislation on the table and then didn't pass it. What we're left with now is much like what the US typically has in its place now, is no sort of one place, one regulation, one set of rules for AI or for even drones for that matter, but rather it's a patchwork of state and provincial legislation in Canada, patchwork of other pieces of legislation that companies are going to have to be very aware of many different sorts of regulations in order to know if they're complying. So, does it help that we've enabled strategy and technology over legislation right now? Or would some guidance be helpful in what is actually required is going to be the question. So I think that's really the crux of the article, Rex.
No, it was a good article. It's interesting read. I like the one line in there, 3 specific items: light, tight, and right. And they only got light right.
Yeah.
So, and I live in that space in the electric aviation world and eVTOL world, advanced air mobility. Technology is outpacing policy every day of the week, and I think AI is even faster than what we are. So, yeah, keeping up is huge. So I'll open it up to Courtney or Chris if you guys want to have any comments on the AI piece. Please jump in.
Well, I was just going to say, one interesting thing that we've seen recently on the US side is this national security policy memorandum that the Trump administration just issued. Sort of, it was really pretty narrow just to sort of defense side AI, but it sort of poses similar interesting questions of like international adoption and whether the standards between countries, especially in between allied countries in the defense space, whether that will matter for AI policy. Do you have any thoughts, Erika, on like how important it is that countries like the US and Canada are aligned on issues like that?
Yeah, I think that it was interesting that it was the strategy was really silent on that specifically. It did, one of the pillars was talking about partners and how do we, achieve trusted partners while maintaining sovereignty. And I think a lot of what Canada intends to do is fall back on the EU Act, because the EU AI Act, because that is really the global standard from its point of view on the framework for AI regulation. And so OECD principles, G7 initiatives. So to the extent that the US is at the table, for example, the G7 initiatives on governance, I do think that having that alignment will be really important as we move forward, especially as Rex said, that, technology is really outpacing the ability to legislate. We're seeing that as well on an international playing field with many of the UN treaties and conventions that parties are signatories to. Those are very outdated and very difficult to update. So I think we're really going to have to rely on those discussions and informal agreements, which makes me as an attorney uneasy.
Yeah, no, I agree with you.
Chris, any thoughts, sir?
Erika, you had posed the question of, how do we address the fact that there's a large population of folks who don't know what drones or AI are being used for. It had me thinking about, the legislative and regulatory piece versus the use cases, and how, in my opinion, drone regulation and legislation has been slow over the decades, whereas AI has somewhat come after drones to a degree, but the degree of legislation and regulation is just through the roof right now. And of course, that's for a number of reasons. There's certain constraints on the drone side that really limit the proliferation of the operations. But would love to flip that question on you as to how you think we could address, um, uh, educating the general public as to what those uses are, both in drones in general as well as AI.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciated the strategy's recognition that this begins with early childhood. In some of my international meetings and conferences, hearing about what's happening in a lot of other countries, which is that children in their primary school learning are learning about AI, deep fakes, how to understand whether something's real or AI generated, receiving information and training on social media use, chatbot use. To me, that's so critical. That's like a critical component of education. I would love to see that curriculum adopted immediately. I realize that when you're rolling out curriculum in such a fast fashion, that you need to be careful about how you're going about it because things are changing so rapidly. But I think that's a starting point. And I really do think that if the governments are behind these strategies, then they really do need to promote the good use cases. It was for the first time for me reading this strategy, I didn't realize how many Nobel Prize winners in AI in Canada existed and what influence they'd had on AI. So you're looking at people that have worked on the Google powered AI system are Canadians. The co-founder of OpenAI is Canadian. I didn't know that until I read this strategy, and that's too late in my opinion if that's what we're trying to achieve in terms of promoting not only our own sovereign use of these technologies, but also the good use cases and the successes that are out there.
No, excellent information, Erika, and fantastic to bring that to light. I think you're right. Education is one of the cornerstones of getting this understood better in the public's mind. So fantastic to bring that out. So next up, I'd like to bring Courtney. You're on deck. Bring your article up and just, okay, why this particular article and what did you find interesting from it?
Well, this is really the perfect intersection of all of my interests, right? A historical, aviation issue sort of taking center stage again with, new technology and a new way forward. I was a history major at Northwestern, so anything that has a historical bent is always, very intriguing to me. But long story short on this one is basically the FAA, took its first major step in a little over 50 years on enabling civil supersonic flight over the continental US. It's an NPRM, so public comment period is open until August 17th. But essentially, the change is that civil aircraft right now cannot fly faster than Mach 1, which is the speed of sound over the US, unless they have a special FAA authorization. And the proposed rule would replace that old speed-based restriction with a noise-based standard. So it's a performance-based rule. And essentially the FAA is saying if a company can prove that the boom that reaches the ground stays below the FAA's proposed limit, then you could essentially conduct supersonic overland flight. The FAA, through this rule, is proposing to measure how strong the sonic boom is when it reaches people's, homes and the ground and the buildings below, not necessarily where the sound is in the sky. And the historical significance of this is that people, did not like sonic booms back in the 60s and 70s when this was sort of starting to take flight, I guess, back in the day. And so the FAA adopted an overland restriction in 1973 because the community acceptance piece wasn't there and the technology wasn't there because, they didn't know what an accepted safe level for sonic boom exposure was. The technology has changed, and it seems like, the FAA and the administration are both comfortable with the concept that companies could prove that their sonic boom is not going to essentially slam into the ground if the aircraft is flown at the right speed and altitude. The wave sort of bends back upward into the atmosphere. And so the key will be sort of demonstrating that to the FAA. And so, the FAA will take comments on this, and then they'll develop a final rule that, ultimately enables it. And ostensibly, typically that is what happens, once the FAA initiates a proposal, although it is possible that they could, change their mind and pull it back. The key with this, as with any emerging aviation technology, especially as we've also seen in the drone and AAM space, is going to be the community acceptance piece, because, the FAA has the safety authority to authorize this, just as they have the safety statutory authority to authorize drone operations or eVTOL operations. But, if people don't want this operating over their house or in their communities, then, you're going to have a whole different set of problems as a company that has nothing to do with the FAA side of the house. So I think that's sort of the remains to be seen piece of this that will be interesting.
No, I remember back a long, long time ago taking a class in aviation law, and our professor was a law judge out of St. Louis, and we took a week and spent on archaic rules still on the book. And I mean, I remember the comment. It's like it's one thing to put a rule in place. This is a totally different animal to get it off the books. So I can understand it's an uphill climb, but it's great to hear that the FAA has opened it up, and we're looking at actually moving that forward. Open it up to Erika and Chris. Thoughts on what Courtney's brought to the table?
Yeah, really interesting article. And, as we're hearing, there's obviously this theme of public trust and community acceptance. I'm curious, does the article or the consultation period touch on that as to how they're going to address that? Something that kind of jumps out to me is that, does the public understand the difference between Mach 1 and, different speeds? And, is their concern not only sound, but safety, despite, the safety not being the issue? So those were the things that kind of came to mind, is how is the FAA going about addressing the community acceptance piece today, as opposed to in 1973?
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting because the NPRM, and I wasn't, involved in this during my time at the FAA, so I can speak to it. The NPRM categorically excludes the environmental analysis, which is pretty typical of a proposal because, the idea is that the agency actually, there's no impact yet because it's just a proposal. But I think it will be interesting to see what the FAA does at the final rule stage from an environmental impact perspective, and if folks push back against that analysis and the comments, because it seems to me that would be the sort of thing that it would be good to sort of get out in front of, rather than sort of categorically excluding away, as sometimes agencies want to do with environmental analyses.
Sounds good. Chris, what are your thoughts, sir?
No, I mean, I find this pretty interesting as well, and I've tracked it for a few years now in terms of just the enabling of supersonic, hypersonic operations, even back to my Hill days, my Capitol Hill days. I'm curious to see how this will evolve, and more specifically, how long it may take to actually come to fruition. The current administration has what 2.5 years left, and this was enabled through an executive order. As folks know, whenever another administration comes in, if the White House were to flip, as an example, I could see a world, not me saying, I'm more than positive something like this would likely get clawed back. And so, honestly, the FAA is on the clock. The FAA is on the clock, I think, to actually get this done to a final version, and more specifically, hopefully they can get on the ball to actually operationalize this for the stakeholders and the actual manufacturers and developers of this technology. I think it'll be very, very fascinating to see if they're able to get there. Courtney knows this better than I do. Quite often, you have these enabling pieces of regulation, legislation, whatever the case is, but at times the stakeholder's not ready. Right. And Courtney knows this better than I do as well. The FAA will not move forward, even if, of course, they have the capabilities to do so, if it's not a safe operation. So, and would love to hear from you, Courtney, on this in terms of what your thoughts are as far as, if the stakeholders can keep up with this pace. Because supersonic, hypersonic is just, it's in its infancy. Of course, it's come and gone in the past, decades, but I would argue it's definitely behind, commercial space, drones, even air taxis. And so we'll have to see how it evolves, but would love to hear from both Courtney and Erika if we don't have anything on that and the stakeholders keeping up.
Yeah, I mean, that is always sort of the tough thing. The FAA, as we well know, the United States has as we like to tout, the safest airspace in the world, right? And so the FAA really you know endeavors to uphold that standard, and it may be that there is a standard in the rule that is not something that the stakeholders can meet at this time. So the rule may, as you're saying, Chris, the rule may come out with a standard, and then the stakeholders may have to sort of continue to develop their technology to get to that point. And that that we've seen that, like, with a great example is the powered lift special federal aviation regulation. The FAA developed what in its view was the safest rule possible for powered lift, which are also known as eVTOLs. And stakeholders are having some issues meeting the requirements of the rule from an operational perspective. And so those are some things that might have to get adjusted down the line. But I think the FAA is definitely open to receiving, demonstrated proof that there is another safer way to do it, as we see in the airworthiness space, with all the compliance and that sort of thing. So I think there's room to wiggle, but we'll sort of have to just wait and see how it develops, as you said, Chris.
Yeah, I think it's for me, it's a very uncomfortable area because as someone providing legal advice to clients about what they can or cannot do, it's things like this that create that difficulty. And as I've watched, as Courtney said, like the regulations evolve to a point where the stakeholders aren't ready to even meet them, then, the question becomes, well, what was the use of that regulation? If, for example, we have low risk BV loss, but we have none of the manufacturers who've met the safety assurance declarations in Canada. So therefore, really, technically, no one can fly low risk BV loss yet. And so they've had to extend out that time for manufacturers to comply. And then you're seeing things like a strategy that don't have anything, but then there are antiquated laws that kind of don't speak, they speak to the contrary. And so, yeah, we're in a very difficult position now with all of these things. Our AI legislation was prorogued because of a change in our government. And so, yeah, I think we're in a very interesting time and space with technology and policy and law. So it's going to be interesting to watch it all unfold.
No, and I think I'll go back to what we talked about earlier with you, Eric. It's the educational piece is going to be a huge piece, because when we present this to the public having worked in those planning and zoning commissions, trying to explain noise studies to a layman and say, okay, what's a decibel and how is it measured? And explaining to them what the logarithmic measurement is. And when somebody says, oh, we're cutting the measurement by half, that doesn't mean you're going from 90 decibels down to 45 decibels. So there's a challenge, I think, also in this. And then, as you said, Courtney, when we're looking at, okay, what is the scale that I am being measured against? We're going from a speed to a pressure. How is that measured? And if I don't pass, what do I have to do to pass? And where's the threshold? So there's a lot of education, I think, there on several different parties. So, Courtney, great article and good insights. Thank you.
Yeah.
With that, Chris, you're up. We'll bring your article up here and tell us what the article's about, why it was of interest to you, and what you gleaned from it, sir.
Sure. So my article is on drones and counter drones at the 2026 FIFA World Cup. There was a lot that happened regarding drones and counter drone operations during the FIFA World Cup, and we can definitely get into a little bit of a hot wash after I go into my opener. But before we do so, I'll get into how it actually. Before we get into how it played out, excuse me, I'll set the table. Oh man, I'm need a glass of water over here. Horrible timing. I'll set the table on what the rules were going into the tournament because I played a little bit of a role as one of the head politicals on drones and some counter drone operations when I was back in the administration, and hopefully I can provide some context. So ahead of the 2026 World Cup, the FAA in particular for U.S. Games designated every U.S. venue as a no drone zone for the length of the event. There were like a good dozen or so. And in plain terms, that means that unauthorized drone flights were flatly prohibited in the designated airspaces and on the surrounding grounds as well. It wasn't just the stadiums, it was practice facilities, it was hotels that the teams and the support staff were staying in. It was relatively far reaching, and there's some skinny that I can get into on the back end of this if you'd like to, as for how that played. But it covered a bunch of stuff. And the mechanism that was used to actually prohibit these operations are called temporary flight restrictions. So around the match venues, as well as these other facilities, there was, generally speaking, a 3 nautical mile bubble of up to 3,000 feet on game days. And then around certain fan events, it was a little bit of a smaller footprint, 1 nautical mile and up to 1,000 feet. And critically, these switched on and off by date, by venue. So you really couldn't assume anything from memory. It was like you had to know aviation and know where the no drone zones were. And understandably so, if you were or are a certificated drone operator, you somewhat should know how to find those stuff. So like I said, you had to check the specific venue on the specific date, which is why the advisory kept pointing the people back to the FA's Before You Fly app and the NOTAM system, as well as the other UAS data feeds. The penalties were stacked and they could hit all at once. Like on the criminal side, you had potential immediate arrests, and there were some. You've had penalties of up to 1 year in prison, and then you also had fines in the thousands of dollars range. And then separately on the civil side, there were other violation penalties in the tens of thousands as well. You could, of course, get your pilot certificate revoked and a few others. But on top of that, the drone itself could be intercepted, it could be grounded, it could be seized. There were a lot of implications as to these restrictions. And the statutory hook that allowed for this, it was under 49 USC sections 46307 and 40103, which make it illegal to not only operate an aircraft as well as drones in these restricted airspaces without authorization. And so one thing I just want to highlight is the baseline compliance rules. They never went away. The tournament raised a bunch of the stakes, though, when it came down to these operations. And as I'm sure you can imagine, with having over a dozen game venues, along with dozens of practice facilities, as well as where the folks were staying, There was a lot going on, a lot of recreational flyers that still needed to fly or they wanted to fly, a lot of commercial drone operators that wanted to fly as well. And like looking into, and we're still, doing a deep dive and a hot wash of it all. Reports are showing that there are over 600 violations that they handed out, that the FAA handed out, and over 100 arrests that at the least bit DOJ and combined with the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, made during these games. And so it's going to be an interesting one. I think that, over the past year, Congress had they expanded counter drone authorities to state and local levels. And this is like the first pilot, if you want to call it that, where they can actually put the framework to practice to see how it will play out. I don't know if it's necessarily going to be a good or bad thing. We'll have to see out of those 600 plus how many of them were actually legitimate. It's funny looking back at my days at the FAA. There were stories and reports of the government taking down its own drones, which is a funny story. It's kind of sad when you think about it, but I know this is being recorded, so let me not get myself in too much trouble. But in all, it's just an interesting thing to look at and think about and see that, with this being the framework, 600 plus violations in a matter of just a few weeks. I'm curious to see how it's going to be when it gets expanded out to all 50 states, the hundreds or thousands of police departments and public safety organizations, how they will use these authorities to actually police drone operations. So.
No, and I think there's some regulations out there for public comment right now on critical infrastructure that this is probably going to inform and play a huge role in when we look at, okay, what is critical infrastructure? How far away are we going to stay from it? And what happens if you violate that? So I see a lot coming down the pike. And as you said, I saw reports of 600 to 700 in cases. And I think last count, they said they had 1,600 incursions that they reported on from the FBI. So very interesting. And I feel sorry for anybody that didn't know and just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I'll open it up. Erika, you're first on giving comments on Chris's article.
Yeah, I think that those are common issues that we're seeing across the globe on critical infrastructure and these types of large scale events, dovetailing with, defense strategies and counter drones. I actually think that piece needs to move also a little bit faster. We have a lot of clients in that space that would really benefit from the ability to not only right now, drones as first responders is taking priority, but I think critical infrastructure should also be up there. And it doesn't really have that same good use case yet that I feel like it should. And the other point that you mentioned were those the unfortunate people that maybe didn't know. And I think that comes back to, again, that there still is very big perception, and especially now that we've made the leap to low risk BVLOS regulations in Canada, that flying a drone is no big deal. So there's still a lot of that misunderstanding of the dangers and the risks that it can cause with manned aviation, as well as commercial flights, as well as the public public infrastructure, critical infrastructure, big events like this. There is a misunderstanding. So I do, again, think these are all really interesting areas that will follow and have relationships with one another, not just in drones, but in technology generally. So yeah, very curious how we're going to protect our data centers, how we're going to protect all of these different things we're building within our own borders that are so important.
Good point.
I agree. Looking at things globally, I'd like to think that it was really, I mean, look, it's been around for some time, but it's definitely elevated to a bit of an unprecedented level in terms of like the weaponization of drones and how it's really become a fear factor for folks. Unfortunately, of course, as I'm sure you all know, we recently lost more service members to additional drone strikes overseas, and it really shows you like the unfortunate capabilities that these things have. And now with that, of course, the U.S. government at the least bit, and many other governments as well, are trying to get ahead of it so that they're prepared, because it's kind of hard to, I guess you could say, defend yourself when you're playing on your back heels and trying to catch up to the technology. But no, it's an interesting, balancing act as well, because like I think that uh, the enabling legislation and regulation has somewhat lagged behind due to like that fear factor a little bit. Um, and now with the that fear materializing, I'm curious to see how it may potentially like stifle the drone community. I don't think it actually will, but perhaps it might delay things a little bit, unless, of course, the counter UAS side of things catches up. Of course, we have this impending BB loss rule, which I'm extremely excited about, and hopefully they get it across the finish line sooner rather than later. But I can definitely see a world where, with all things happening, the security agencies in the U.S. at the least bit, they try to put a pause on that, because of the potential that the potential risk, should I say, that drones pose. But Courtney, I know this is your backbone as well. You've dealt with this more than I have. Would love to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, well, a couple thoughts. I think, as we were talking about with 2209 being out for comment right now, obviously that's interesting. And then you've also got the Safer Skies Act, IFR, out for comment right now. And that, I think what I'm hearing most from folks I work with is compliant operators who are concerned, about the possibility that their drone is going to get taken down, even though they're doing everything right. And so I think that is going to be the really interesting thing about how this all plays out, is how do you get that balance between allowing folks who are, just trying to run their business, and folks who are, obviously bad actors. And I think I saw a funny video on like Instagram or TikTok or something of a guy who was a real estate agent who was legitimately just trying. He like wasn't even that close to the stadium, but I think the TFR extended and he wasn't paying good attention, and he was just trying to film his like condo or something that he was listing, and then a whole bunch of federal agents showed up like almost instantly. And it's just stuff like that. It's gonna be interesting to see how it all plays out, and especially as you mentioned, Chris, with Part 108. It's such an interesting dynamic between the economic folks at the White House and the security folks, right? Because we have the drone dominance order that says, get 108 out at this point, like yesterday, like a year ago, but you also have the very real security concerns from the security agencies, and I have to imagine that's what's sort of kept it on a sort of a slower track at this point. And so, yeah, I am interested. The 12866 meetings will be coming up for that rule at OIRA. It's now at OIRA. It'll be interesting to sort of see what the public is saying about it to the White House as well. I'm sure that will inform things. So thanks, Chris. That was the very interesting topic for sure.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's kind of funny too, because when you look at how the conversation around drones has evolved,
Yeah.
it used to be everything around the drone threat to manned aircraft, and now it's shifted to the security element.
Yeah.
Granted, of course, the risk that it poses to manned aircraft has, in my opinion, not changed, but I don't think it's as overblown as people make it out to believe. When I've sat on a few panels in the past, I would always frame the argument this way. Drones have been around for a decent amount of time. Let's just play it safe and say 10, 15 years in terms of like the drones as we know them today.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, okay, all right, guys, everybody in the audience, how many of you all have ever flown a drone? And many of them raise their hand. How many of you all know the regs as it relates to drones? Many of them raise their hand because it's usually attorneys, but there's literally millions of drones that have been sold in the U.S. on an annual basis. And imagine how much lack of knowledge there is out there, and how many BB loss operations there actually were. We haven't had, at the least bit, until perhaps recently, like a midair like that. Granted, like I said, we may have recently had one. I'm not involved in that mix, but the ultimate point is sometimes this stuff can get overblown. But I definitely don't think that that's the case now, especially when it comes down to the security stuff. And I would even argue I don't think it's overblown either when it comes down to the risk posed to manned aircraft. So I appreciate the opportunity, Rex.
No, Chris, thank you. I know one of the issues we've talked about on Capitol Hill, specifically on the drone side and the BVLOS side, is doing a better job of providing drone operators with accurate information of where that critical infrastructure lives. And that's one of the issues we've been really fighting. Is we did a study with NASA back in 2019 and identified nearly 2,000 hospital heliports in the United States that the FAA has no record of. I work and live in Indiana. It's like 32 hospitals, and some I used to fly to back in the early 90s that are still not in the system. And then there's those that are in the system, but they're inaccurate. And there's no, number one, there's no budget, and there's no staffing in the FAA to go back and actually evaluate that and update it. So there, I think we're doing the drone industry a disservice by providing them with bad information, because when you open up your before you fly app and you think you're doing everything right and the information we're providing you is incorrect, I think we can do better as an industry. So, but Chris, thank you. I'm going to ask Michael, our co-host here from Full Crew. Do we have any questions on your side, Michael?
I appreciate you asking me. No one normally does. No, actually, today I don't.
Okay.
But
I wanted to make sure I included you, because I know you're working harder than we are. So yes.
Oh no, you guys made it easy. I mean, these are topics that are supremely important to discuss and get over the regulatory hurdles. And I really appreciate how everybody put consideration into public perception, because I think that's often not discussed. How do we inform the public enough? And then even if we inform them enough, are they going to be satisfied with that? Maybe the path to actual implementation requires more infrastructure work for them to feel comfortable in the first place. So, yeah, anyway, we could move on to the end of the show. Rex, so to close it off, feel free to ask everybody how they could get in contact with our guests. Maybe we could just go around the horn.
No, sounds good.
Starting with yourself.
Well, I'm out there everywhere. I run a company called 5 Alpha. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm fairly prolific there. I also work for Vertical Flight Society and also work with Dawn on several different areas as an ambassador for infrastructure. Probably LinkedIn is probably the best place to find me, but I do several articles for Dawn that go out in Autonomy Global. Erika, where can people find you? How can they contact you? And where are you most visible at?
You can find me everywhere. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on the MLT Aitkins website at www.mltaikins.com. I'm also the robotics ambassador for Autonomy Global. So if you're enjoying those articles, let me know. And yeah, I'm pretty easy to find. So please reach out. Would love to connect with everyone out there.
Thank you very much. And Courtney, how about you?
Well, like everybody else, I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me on the Adams and Reese website. My email is courtney.freeman@arlaw.com. And I'll be at Commercial UAV if anybody is going to be there. Speaking on a panel where Dawn is moderating on cutting through the legalese of statutory and regulatory requirements. So that should be a pretty good one in September there in Las Vegas. But yeah, that I'm sure you'll be able to find me.
Excellent. Chris?
Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find as well. Feel free to Google my name, put aviation at the end, because there is like a professional skateboarder or something out there that has me beat. But outside of Google, of course, I have my own LinkedIn as well. And if you, of course, are in need of legal services, then just going to gtlaw.com. I'm also reachable there, or chris.senn at gtlaw.com is my email address. So yeah, I think we're all pretty easy to find, but certainly.
Well, thank you all three for a fantastic discussion down in the weeds in tech policy. So with that, we're going to wrap up our amazing show. This will be posted and online. So if you missed anything, go back and listen to it. Before we go, I want to make sure that once again, we thank our sponsors. Again, always powered by LiveU, and our sponsors, Airspace Link and Viasat. And for the full crew, I'm Rex Alexander, and we're out here.